My family thought they were stealing $850,000 from me that night. They were actually giving me the evidence I needed to destroy their entire plan. At exactly 8:17 p.m., I sat beneath the warm amber lights of an upscale restaurant, my hands resting calmly beside a half-finished glass of sparkling water. The room smelled faintly of butter, rosemary, and expensive perfume. Crystal glasses caught the light above us while soft piano music drifted through the dining room. Across the table, my father, Marcus, leaned back in his chair like he owned the restaurant. My mother, Denise, sat beside him, watching me with that familiar expression she used whenever she expected me to surrender. My husband, Julian, looked completely relaxed. Then my father said it. "Naomi, you're going to transfer $850,000 from your investment account. Camille and Julian need it for the property." I stared at him for a moment, not because I was shocked by the amount, because of how casually he said it. $850,000. As though he had asked me to cover dinner. My private investment account had taken years of discipline to build. I had worked through weekends, missed vacations, and accepted difficult clients while building my crisis management firm from the ground up. Yet somehow my family had decided my success belonged to everyone except me. "You've done well," my mother said softly. "It's time to help your sister." I didn't argue. I didn't ask why Camille couldn't contribute more. I didn't ask why Julian needed my money. I simply lowered my eyes and listened. Then Julian switched into French. He did it smoothly, almost casually, assuming I would hear meaningless sounds. Marcus answered him in English, and Julian smiled before continuing. "Elle finira par accepter," Julian said. "She'll eventually agree." My breathing remained steady. Then he added, "La pression familiale fonctionne toujours avec elle." Family pressure always works on her. I understood every word. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe and stay with me, because they had absolutely no idea what I already possessed. For years, I had quietly built something my family knew nothing about. A protected investment trust. Its current value was approximately $4 million. My grandfather had helped establish the structure years earlier, and I had carefully grown it without discussing the details with anyone. My parents knew I had money. They didn't know how much was protected. More importantly, they didn't know what I had learned about protecting it. I watched Julian lift his wineglass and smile at my father. They thought they were winning. They thought I was sitting there confused, intimidated, and trapped by family expectations. But I was listening to every sentence, every number, every assumption. Then Julian leaned slightly toward my father and spoke again in French. This time his words made my stomach tighten. It wasn't about Camille's house. It wasn't even about helping my sister. There was another reason they needed my $850,000. And suddenly the restaurant felt much colder. And for the first time that evening, I stopped wondering why they needed my money. I started wondering what they were hiding behind it from me. They thought I didn't understand French. What they didn't know was that I understood exactly how much they were planning to take from me. I learned early that my family had two versions of love. There was the love they gave me when I succeeded, provided my success benefited someone else. Then there was the love they withdrew whenever I challenged their expectations. My sister, Camille, rarely had to question which version she would receive. She was lighter-skinned than me, effortlessly social, and comfortable in every room. Relatives often praised her appearance with compliments that sounded harmless until I noticed who received them. "She has the kind of look that opens doors," my aunt once said. My mother smiled proudly. I remembered standing beside them, dark-skinned and quiet, pretending those words didn't land heavily. Marcus compared us constantly. Camille was graceful. Camille was approachable. Camille knew how to make people like her. I was intelligent, serious, ambitious, and somehow always too difficult. When Camille needed money, my parents called it family responsibility. When I saved money, they called it selfishness waiting to happen. I understood the pattern before I understood the name for it. Conditional love. If I succeeded, they wanted a portion of my success. If I disagreed, they questioned my character. If Camille failed, I was expected to become the solution. So I stopped expecting fairness. Instead, I built something they couldn't control. I became a crisis management consultant. My work involved helping companies survive reputational disasters, financial emergencies, executive scandals, and internal breakdowns. I learned how quickly polished stories collapsed when someone followed the money. My income eventually surpassed everyone in my immediate family. Marcus still refused to respect it. "You move paperwork around for rich people," he told me once. I smiled politely. He didn't understand that paperwork could expose millions of dollars in liability. He never needed to. Then Julian entered our lives. He arrived gradually, first as a name in conversations, then as Camille's sophisticated boyfriend, and eventually as the man my parents treated like royalty. Julian was polished, multilingual, confident, and surrounded by the kind of professional connections Marcus admired. He knew how to shake hands while maintaining eye contact. He knew which restaurants impressed investors. He knew exactly when to mention a private equity contact or an overseas property deal. Marcus idolized him almost immediately. I watched my father's posture change whenever Julian entered a room. Suddenly Marcus listened. Suddenly Marcus laughed louder. Suddenly, everything Julian said sounded like wisdom. Julian noticed my skepticism. He began making small comments about my career. "Consulting is useful," he said once, smiling. "But real power comes from owning assets, not selling advice." I let the comment pass. Then he started speaking French around me. First it happened occasionally. Then it became a habit. He would turn toward Marcus, say something in French, and glance at me afterward. My mother would laugh. Camille would laugh too. When I asked what he had said, Julian would give me an innocent smile. Nothing important. That answer became routine. They thought the language created a wall around their conversations. What they didn't know was that I had understood more French than they realized. I never corrected them. I listened. That silence became useful. I began noticing details they probably considered irrelevant. Julian talked about investors who trusted him with small amounts of money. I heard references to employees whose retirement accounts were connected to one of his companies. I learned about an elderly couple who had invested their savings after Marcus personally recommended Julian. I didn't know the entire story yet, but I knew enough to become concerned. Then Camille showed me preliminary property documents. She was excited. The purchase involved a luxury property, and her name was already attached to documents I had never seen. I noticed the financing structure immediately. My parents expected me to provide the money. Apparently, my $850,000 wasn't being discussed as a loan requiring proper repayment terms. It was being treated like family money. Later, I heard Julian speaking privately with Marcus. His voice was calm. "She'll agree," he said. "You know how to pressure her." Marcus chuckled. I stood outside the room completely still. They weren't guessing how I would react. They had studied me. They knew my father's authority. They knew my mother's guilt. They knew Camille's helplessness. And Julian understood exactly how those things could be used against me. That was when something inside me became completely still. Julian wasn't merely manipulating my family. He had been studying them. And now I understood that he had been studying me too, long before I realized. I started documenting Julian's conversations the morning after I realized his French was never meant to impress me. It was meant to exclude me. For years, I had allowed my family to believe I understood only enough French to recognize a greeting or read a menu. That assumption had been useful, so I never corrected it. I had learned French years earlier working with international corporate clients. My job required reviewing cross-border communications and understanding conversations where a misunderstood phrase could change negotiations. I never told my parents. I never told Camille. And I certainly never told Julian. I knew exactly what would happen if they discovered another skill I possessed. They would either dismiss it or find a way to use it. So I listened. I kept a private record of dates, times, statements, and financial references. I documented only what mattered, preserving the distinction between suspicion and evidence. At 6:42 a.m., my phone vibrated against the marble surface of my kitchen counter. Julian had sent me a message. I opened it while the coffee machine hummed behind me. The message contained several financial figures connected to the property purchase. I compared those numbers with publicly available records from his investment company. They didn't match. Not by a rounding error. Not by some harmless accounting difference. The discrepancy made me put my coffee down. I opened the company's public filings and checked them again. Then I checked them again. My professional instincts were already awake. Money leaves patterns. When numbers don't align, someone usually has an explanation. When the explanation doesn't exist, someone usually has something to hide. Later that afternoon, I heard Julian speaking French with my father. I stopped outside the room. I didn't enter. I listened. Julian laughed softly before saying that I was too emotional to understand real finance. Marcus laughed with him. My jaw tightened, but I kept my face relaxed. Then Julian's tone changed. If she refuses the transfer, he said, you can make her look unstable. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Julian continued. Tell the family she's becoming selfish. Tell them success has changed her. I stood perfectly still there. My father eventually said, she won't want everyone against her. Julian laughed. That is exactly why she will pay. I felt something colder than anger settle inside me. Until that moment, I had believed they were trying to finance Camille's property. Now I understood the truth. The $850,000 wasn't really for the house. It was meant to cover a financial hole inside Julian's investment company. Suddenly, every conversation made sense. The urgency, the pressure, the numbers. The way Julian kept insisting that my money needed to move quickly. I returned to my office and began building a timeline. I compared his statements against company information, property documents, and the financial figures he had sent me. The pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. Julian had built his reputation around confidence, connections, and access. He knew how to enter wealthy rooms and make people believe he belonged there. He used polished language, expensive clothes, influential contacts, and the assumptions people often made about successful white executives to create credibility before anyone examined the details. He didn't need everyone to trust his numbers. He only needed enough people to trust him. The victims made that realization heavier. One of Julian's former employees was facing foreclosure because money promised for an investment account had disappeared. I read the details twice. That employee wasn't a wealthy investor with lawyers waiting nearby. That was someone's home, someone's stability, someone's future. I sat back from my desk and stared at the screen. This was no longer about my family taking $850,000 from me. It wasn't even about proving Julian had lied. It was about understanding how many people had already paid the price for his image. For the first time, my anger moved somewhere useful. At 11:53 p.m., I sat alone in my home office. The house was silent except for my computer's low hum. I looked at the documents spread across my desk, and the weight of everything finally reached me. I cried. Quietly. Not because of the money. I cried because I finally accepted something I had spent years refusing to believe. My parents would protect Julian before they protected me if protecting him preserved their status. That realization hurt more than the money. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. Then I closed the document. My breathing slowed. The woman who had spent years trying to earn fairness from my family was gone. I wasn't going to beg them or argue. I was going to understand the structure they had built around me, identify every weakness, and protect everything that was mine. I picked up my phone. There was one person I trusted to help me understand exactly how much protection I already had. Elias Grant. At 11:58 p.m. I called him. When he answered, I didn't explain everything. I simply said, I need to know exactly what I own, and exactly what they can't touch. At 9:15 a.m. the following morning, I met Elias Grant in his quiet office overlooking downtown. Rain tapped against the windows, and the smell of dark coffee hung in the air. Elias had known my grandfather for decades, and I trusted him because he never confused family loyalty with financial judgment. He opened a leather folder and looked directly at me. Your grandfather planned for this, he said. I didn't answer. Elias explained that years earlier, my grandfather had established a protected family investment structure. Once I reached the required age, I became its controlling beneficiary. The structure had been designed to separate my long-term assets from ordinary accounts and outside pressure. Then Elias gave me the number. Approximately $4 million. I stared at him. The money was completely separate from the account my parents believed contained my available cash. They knew I was successful. They knew I had investments, but they had absolutely no idea that my most valuable assets were protected beyond their reach. For years, I had assumed my grandfather was simply being cautious. That morning, I realized he had been thinking several steps ahead. But Elias hadn't called me there merely to discuss the trust. He placed another folder on the table. Inside was a signed investment agreement connected to Julian. The document showed how certain funds had been represented as legitimate investment capital. Additional records suggested those funds had been redirected toward unrelated obligations. My stomach tightened. This is enough to ask serious questions, Elias said. But don't confront him. He handed me a secure flash drive. It contained recorded conversations, supporting documents, and communications relevant to the transactions I had already started questioning. Then came emails demonstrating misleading representations about where certain funds were going. I looked at everything spread across the table. Trust documents, investment agreements, bank transaction records, recorded conversations, emails. It wasn't one piece of evidence. It was a pattern. Elias leaned back. Let him keep talking, he told me. Every arrogant statement creates another potential piece of evidence. I understood immediately. My instinct had been to confront Julian before he could hurt anyone else. But Elias reminded me that anger could give him an opportunity to change his story. So I chose patience. That morning, I began building a legal and financial strategy with my attorney. I didn't threaten my parents. I didn't accuse Camille. I didn't send Julian an angry message. Instead, I quietly removed their access to anything connected to my finances. I froze the planned $850,000 transfer. I contacted my bank and confirmed that no authorization could move those funds without my direct approval. I reviewed the trust protections again. Then I began organizing documentation concerning the investors who might have been harmed. Every step was deliberate. Every decision created another layer between my money and their demands. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to my family. I was controlling the situation. I also asked my attorney to distinguish what we knew from what we could prove. That distinction mattered. Suspicion could explain my instincts, but documentation could protect me when the pressure became public. We reviewed account ownership, authorization limits, contractual obligations, and the timing of the proposed transfer. I wanted no loose ends that Julian could later exploit. I also preserved the original files rather than relying on screenshots or edited copies. Elias reminded me that evidence was strongest when its chain of custody remained clear. I wrote down every timestamp. I saved every message. I kept every document where it belonged. The work felt calm. There was no confrontation, no slam door, and no satisfying speech. There was only preparation. That was enough. For years, my family had trained me to react emotionally whenever they applied pressure. Now I was learning to make pressure work in my favor. At 3:28 p.m., my phone vibrated. Julian. His message was direct. Where is the $850,000? I read it once. I didn't respond. 3 minutes later, another message appeared. We need this handled today. I placed my phone beside the folder and continued reviewing documents. Another message arrived. Naomi, don't make this difficult. I watched the screen light up again. His confidence was beginning to disappear. They believed my silence meant fear. They thought I was overwhelmed, confused, or preparing to surrender. They had absolutely no idea what was happening behind my silence. Every unanswered message preserved his demands exactly as written. Every new message showed increasing pressure. Every impatient sentence strengthened the record I was building. I didn't need to provoke him. I only needed to let him reveal himself. At 4:11 p.m., another notification appeared. This one wasn't from Julian. It was an invitation to a private investor meeting. Julian planned to announce his next major deal. I read the invitation carefully, then looked at the evidence spread across my desk. I knew exactly what he was going to say. More importantly, I knew exactly how I was going to answer. So I accepted. For once, I wasn't walking into his world unprepared. I was walking in with everything he believed I didn't have. The first thing I noticed was how quickly Julian's world became smaller. For years, he had moved through expensive rooms as though every door belonged to him. Now attorneys were reviewing his financial records, authorities were examining transactions, and people who once competed for his attention suddenly stopped returning his calls. I watched the changes without celebrating them. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone's life collapse. There was only relief. The legal review began quietly. Financial records were compared against contracts, transaction histories, representations made to investors, and the documents I had preserved. Every number had to tell the same story, and Julian's numbers did not. His investment relationships began disappearing one by one. A business partner withdrew from a pending arrangement. Another requested independent financial verification. Then another stopped communicating entirely. The luxury image Julian had built so carefully began losing its shine. The expensive restaurants remained open. The tailored suits still fit. The watches still looked impressive. But the invitations became fewer. The phone calls became shorter. The confidence became harder to maintain. His reputation had always been his strongest asset. Now it was becoming evidence against him. I could have made everything public. I could have posted screenshots. I could have exposed every lie on social media and watched thousands of people react. I didn't. I didn't need humiliation. I needed accountability. So I stayed quiet while contracts, banking restrictions, preserved communications, and legal proceedings did what anger never could. The innocent people affected by Julian finally began receiving legal representation. Some were investors who had trusted his polished presentations. Others were employees whose retirement funds had become entangled with one of his companies. I learned that several were pursuing recovery of money they believed had been safely invested. That part stayed with me. These weren't abstract numbers anymore. They were people's savings, their homes, their retirement plans, their sense of security. I knew I couldn't undo what had already happened, but I could refuse to become another person protecting him. Meanwhile, my father's world began shrinking too. Marcus had promoted Julian enthusiastically. He had spoken about Julian's connections, his business instincts, and his supposed ability to recognize opportunities before everyone else. Now people were asking Marcus uncomfortable questions. Why had he recommended Julian? What had he known? Why had he encouraged other people to trust him? Several business relationships quietly disappeared. The same circles Marcus had spent years trying to impress became distant. Calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped arriving. Messages that once received immediate responses remained unread. I remembered how often my father had told me that reputation was everything. Now I understood the irony. His obsession with status had become his weakness. He had trusted Julian because Julian looked like the kind of man Marcus wanted to stand beside. And when that image cracked, Marcus had nowhere to hide. My mother handled everything differently. Denise called me repeatedly. The first few calls went unanswered. Eventually I answered one. Her voice was soft. Naomi, we're still family. I knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't asking how I felt. She was testing whether the old weapon still worked. I know, I said. Then you have to help us. I looked across my office at the financial documents protecting everything I had built. No, Mom. There was silence. You can't do this to your family. I breathed slowly. I am not doing anything to you. But Camille needs help. I know. And your father is losing everything. I know. Her voice became sharper. Then how can you sit there and do nothing? I answered quietly. Because helping you would mean giving you money you don't have a right to. For once, the word family could not open my wallet. It could not override a contract. It could not bypass a banking restriction. It could not reach into my protected trust. Denise had spent years teaching me that family meant sacrifice. I had finally learned that sacrifice without boundaries was simply exploitation. Camille's reality changed next. The luxury lifestyle she had expected began disappearing piece by piece. The property plans collapsed. Expenses that once seemed effortless suddenly became impossible to maintain. She had to sell possessions, cancel plans, and confront financial decisions she had previously expected someone else to solve. I didn't punish her. I didn't celebrate her embarrassment. I simply refused to rescue her. That distinction mattered to me. I had spent years being treated as the family emergency fund. Now everyone had to live with their own decisions. Julian's consequences were more serious. His assets were frozen where appropriate. Lawsuits followed. Business relationships deteriorated. His financial activities remained under investigation, and every representation he had made was being examined more carefully. The man who once walked into rooms surrounded by admiration now walked into rooms where people wanted documentation. That was the real reversal. His greatest weapon had been reputation. Now reputation worked against him. People who once praised his sophistication began questioning every number he presented. Every confident promise needed verification. Every signature needed context. Every transaction needed an explanation. I didn't have to destroy Julian. He had built a structure that was already collapsing under its own contradictions. I only stopped holding it up. Months later, I drove to my grandfather's old house. I hadn't been there in a long time. The house smelled the same. Old wood, dust, faint traces of cedar from the closet near the hallway. I walked into the living room and sat in the same chair where my grandfather used to sit during quiet evenings. I remembered his voice. He had once told me that wealth wasn't only about what I inherited. Sometimes, he said, wealth was knowing what nobody else knew. At the time, I thought he was talking about money. Now I understood. He had left me more than an investment account. He had left me protection. I called Elias later that afternoon. He explained something I hadn't fully understood before. My grandfather had anticipated the possibility of family pressure. The trust had been intentionally structured so that no family member could simply guilt, threaten, or pressure me into surrendering control. The money wasn't merely protected from creditors or careless spending. It was protected from manipulation. I sat quietly as Elias explained the structure again. My family had spent years assuming I had nothing. They had mistaken privacy for weakness. They had mistaken silence for helplessness. and they had mistaken my willingness to help for an obligation to obey. During those months I learned something else. Justice rarely arrives with the timing people expect. Sometimes it arrives as an email from an attorney, a frozen account, a canceled meeting, or a document requesting answers. Sometimes it arrives quietly enough that nobody notices. That was how I wanted it. I wanted the truth to move through systems designed to test it. I wanted every victim to have a chance to recover what could be recovered. And I wanted my family to finally understand that my silence had never meant surrender. It had meant I was thinking. I opened the trust documents one final time. The pages were quiet beneath my fingertips. No shouting. No arguments. No revenge speech. Just signatures, clauses, dates, and the protection my grandfather had built long before I understood why I would need it. I closed the folder. For the first time, I felt no anger toward my family. I felt free. They had spent years teaching me that love had conditions. I finally learned that my freedom didn't. Months later, my life looked nothing like the life I had once accepted. My consulting firm had expanded into a larger office, and I had taken on clients who needed more than reputation management. They needed protection. They needed someone willing to follow the money when everyone else was distracted by appearances. I created an advisory initiative for people who had been financially exploited. I helped them understand contracts, organize records, recognize warning signs, and find qualified legal professionals when needed. I also established a foundation focused on financial education and protection for families lacking sophisticated advice. My grandfather's lesson finally made sense, and I could finally hear my own voice clearly. Knowledge could be protection. Marcus experienced his own education. The invitations disappeared first, then the calls, then the casual conversations with people he once considered friends. His name became associated with Julian's scandal, and every room he entered carried a little more silence. The social status he had protected so carefully began slipping away. I never announced his downfall. I never celebrated it. I simply watched the consequences arrive. Denise remained bitter. She called occasionally, still trying to reach the version of me who believed saying no made me a bad daughter. Sometimes she reminded me of family sacrifices and Camille's needs. But guilt no longer moved me. I had finally separated love from obligation. Camille's transformation was quieter. She began rebuilding her life without expecting me to finance it. She canceled plans she couldn't afford, sold possessions, and started making decisions based on reality rather than appearances. I didn't punish her. I didn't rescue her either. That was enough. Julian's downfall was the most visible. His polished image was gone. The man who once entered rooms surrounded by admiration now entered them surrounded by questions. Attorneys examined financial statements, contracts, transaction histories, and representations he had made to investors. The confidence that once impressed people now demanded verification. And I remembered the French conversations. He had once believed that another language made him untouchable. It hadn't. Looking back, I understood how completely I had changed. I used to think silence meant weakness. I thought speaking louder would make people finally respect me. I was wrong. Silence can be preparation. Silence can be observation. Silence can give you distance to recognize what someone is trying to do. I never needed to become louder than my family. I needed to become impossible to manipulate. That difference changed everything. For years, I believed protecting myself financially might make me selfish. I had been taught that boundaries were disrespectful and saying no meant I lacked compassion. Now I understood something simpler. Protecting what I built wasn't selfish. Setting boundaries wasn't cruelty. Refusing to fund someone's deception wasn't betrayal. Betrayal was asking someone to sacrifice herself so another person could maintain a comfortable lie. My story began with a restaurant conversation at 8:17 p.m. My husband believed French could hide the truth from me. He believed my family could pressure me into surrendering $850,000. He believed my silence meant confusion. They were all wrong. I understood every word. But more importantly, I finally understood the people speaking those words. I understood my father's obsession with status. I understood my mother's use of guilt. I understood Camille's dependence. And I understood Julian's confidence. Most importantly, I understood myself. I no longer needed anyone's permission to protect my future. I no longer needed approval before trusting my instincts. And I no longer confused being loving with being available for exploitation. If you have ever been underestimated by people who claim to love you, remember this. You don't have to become cruel. You can become careful, informed, and financially prepared. You can walk away from manipulation without becoming bitter. Sometimes the person who underestimates you gives you the greatest advantage of all. Julian thought the language protected him. My family thought their pressure protected them. They never realized that my quietness was giving me time to understand everything. The real mistake wasn't speaking French. The real mistake was believing I wasn't listening. They thought I didn't understand their language, but what they never understood was that I had finally learned the language of my own worth.